Hello, hello, and welcome to our very last virtual meetup for the year. Wow, I can't believe that this is going to be our last one. It's gone so quickly. I don't have any virtual meetups organised yet for the new year, but stay tuned. We will have some very, very soon. My name is Danielle Stein-Fairhurst. I'm a financial modelling specialist, and in these virtual meetups, I like to bring different speakers to you that are useful and interesting to financial modellers. So I'll start with the welcome to country, which is to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which I am on here in Sydney and that we are meeting virtually today. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So today we are joined by a very special guest, Gary Knott. So Gary is a business modelling specialist. He's based in Germany. He's a consultant, an Excel specialist, and he is the author of this fabulous book, Avoid Excel Horror Stories. So he is going to tell us a couple of horror stories, I think, from this book today. He's going to talk about how to prevent user error when developing your Excel models. So welcome, Gary. Thanks so much for joining us again.
You're welcome. I'm very pleased to be here.
Yeah, you ran a session for us last year, which was one of our most popular sessions. So I'm so pleased that you agreed to do it again. So thank you.
Very good. You're welcome. So yes, as Danielle just says, I'm an experienced expert in Excel. Since 2006, my focus has been only on Excel and also later in Power BI. So developing Excel models and tools, doing Excel training. And I'm very passionate about error prevention. That's why I wrote this book, as Danielle mentioned, and now I'm presenting this webinar on preventing user errors. So to start us off, we're going to have a poll question. So what types of user error have you experienced in a financial model or other workbook? You only have the possibility to select one, but please select the one which has either produced the biggest error, or the one you've seen the most often, or the one you'd most like to know about how you can prevent these kind of errors happening.
Okay. If you are joining us on Zoom, you should see the little poll question should just pop up. Otherwise, you can see what the questions are on Gary's screen. So just let us know which you think is the biggest error, I suppose, or the type of user error that you think is the most or the worst kind of user error, just to let Gary know. I'll give it just another minute or a few seconds. Great. Okay. I think most people who are live on the call have had a chance to vote. So I am going to end the poll now and we'll share the results. Okay, that's really interesting. Wow, so we can see that 43% of people have overtyped, hard-coded or deleted formulas. That's interesting, Gary.
Yes, I think that was what I would have chosen as well. That's the error I most see, but the other errors also do crop up. And therefore, we want to have a look at how can we prevent these kinds of errors. So let's have a look at today. I've prepared a little case study. You are working in the finance department at Acme Inc. and the CFO just sent you a mail. And I'm concerned about the 5-year sales planning file created by your predecessor, as we seem to get lots of user errors with it. You will find it on the server. Can you please improve it to prevent user errors? Okay, so let's have a look at what the file is going to look like. See if we can find the file that we need to have a look at and improve. So here is a folder where it's a sales plan folder. And here we can see the first issue that we've got lots of files here. We don't immediately see which one is the latest version to use. So this is something which is very important to make sure users know which is the correct file version to use. And to try and prevent user errors here, I can give you tip number 1, which has 2 parts. One is to have a clear naming convention. So ideally in the names of the files, you should have either the date or a version number, which we don't have here. And the second thing is to store it in a folder to move old items to subfolders, so that in the main folder you only have one version of the file, which is the final version. So, and you can't unfortunately rely on looking at sorting it by the date modified to see which is the latest version, because we can see here this is looks to be a backup copy here, but it has the latest save date, so you can't really rely on that. So what I recommend is to have two folders, two subfolders, one which I call archive, and that is for versions of the planning file which were either sent to people by email, they were used in presentations, they were used in meetings, they're versions of the file that went out to people so people know them. So we want to keep a copy of those, even though they're not the final version, in case we get questions on them. So that kind of what I'm going to do is to assume anything without copying them is a version which was used. So I'm going to move those into archive, and already we're looking a lot better. And then I have another file, another folder called ZZZ old. I call it ZZ so that it always appears at the end of my list of folders because it's sorted alphabetically. And there I store any backup copies which I made during the course of the development. Those are just working versions in case something went wrong. I want to keep them just in case I need to, in case I had an error, I want to check on something. But I'm going to move those into the old folder. So now we've got much more clarity here. We've got the final version in this folder. We can clearly see this is the version to use. So that's my tip number one. In the course of the webinar, we're going to go through 6 top tips to prevent user errors. That's the first one, version control. So now let's have a look at this file. Let's open it up and see what it looks like. So if we go into Excel, we can see here, oh, what's going on here. My first reaction is, oh, no wonder there's user errors with this file. Look at it, it looks very ugly. We've got some letters over here, not very clear what they are. We've got some numbers, got some highlighted numbers here, why they highlighted. We've got some percentages down here. What do they represent? There's no labels to them. What's this number doing down here?
Gary, is there any chance you could maybe blow it up just a little bit?
Yeah, okay, okay, make it a bit bigger. Okay,
fantastic,
fine.
thank you.
Good. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to also look at the formulas in formulas view. So if I go to the tab formulas, I can show formulas and just have a look here what's going on. So we can see that some of the cells are numbers input, so they're hard-coded inputs. Some of them are formulas with a reference to a cell down here. So maybe that's supposed to be a percentage increase in the sales. And here we've got some hard-coded percentages. Again, we've got some inputs down here in this cell here. We've got some related, it's a formula referring to this 2%, but we've also got a hard-coded addition there. So that's all not looking very good. So no wonder there's user errors with this kind of file. So how could we improve this? We can improve it. That was our task. If you remember from the CFO, we need to improve this file. Well, certainly I would try to make things clearer by clear labeling. These percentages here, we need to have a label and we need to include them next to the calculations for to which they relate. And also what I see is here in this row here, we've got a mixture of actual figures for the actual periods, and then we've got formulas for the plan figures. It's just all trying to do too much in one row. So let's try and split them out. So this is what we might get if we try to improve that. So now we've got, if this is much clearer, we've got the names of the brands which we're planning. So there's 3 brands at Acme Inc, Alpha, Beta, and Gamma. And we've split out now some of the figures onto separate rows. So we've got the actual figures. It's very clear now what those 2 figures are. We've got some actual growth percentages, some plan percentages, which are inputs. And there's also the possibility to have a manual input if you want to have a specific figure. And then we've got the sales value used. Okay, so here we can see this is looking a lot better. However, I still have 2 issues with this file. One is that we can't clearly see, or the user cannot clearly see which cells are the input cells where they can change figures. That's the first issue. And the second issue is that they are not protected at all, which means the user can go in and overtype formulas, can add hard coding, or can even delete the whole lot. So for these 2 reasons, this is a lot better than the first version, but we want to have a better version, which is even better. So I'm going to save that one, and I'm going to show you a version which I've created now, which includes all the tips which we're going to go through today. So first of all, we can see I've followed my own advice, having an archive and old folder. So in the main folder, we've only got 1 file, and it's clearly labeled with a naming convention. So we've got the date that this was last updated in October. We're now in November, so that looks to be the last one. if I open that, we can see what's going on here. So the first thing you'll notice is, oh, it asks us for a password. So this is the second tip: restrict access to authorized users only. So there's really two ways you can do that: to store the files in a folder which is restricted, has restricted access. For example, only the people in the finance department can access this folder. That's one way. And or you can use a password. So here I've got a password. And by the way, this file, you will get this file, which I'm about to show you, in the handouts after the webinar. So the password you'll need to know that it's in the handouts as well, but it's I would tell you it's Tuesday, because today's Tuesday. So, and now it tells me I've got the model will now be protected from changes. So I click OK, and it will now go through, and the model is now protected from changes. Danielle, is that big enough? Can you see that clearly?
Fine.
Or make it a bit bigger. I'm 140.
If you're able, yeah.
Yes. Okay. So we can see the first thing was that it asked you for a password and then protected. So that's certainly very good. So that's the second tip. The third tip then is to develop workbooks using best practice for clarity and ease of use. What does that mean? Well, first of all, we can see this certainly looks a lot more professional than the other versions we looked at. We have a cover sheet, and the cover sheet is very useful because it tells you the name of a contact. So if a user has a question, how do I do something? What does this mean? They know who they can contact. So that will help prevent user errors if they can ask questions. They know the date when it was last updated. They've got the purpose of the model. They can see the contents of the model. So that's the first thing. The second point is to see it's clearly structured. So we have an input sheets, calculations, and output sheets. So they can at least know, if not in detail how it works, at least they can see the main data flows, and they can have a good idea where they need to go to change the inputs. Okay. And very last but not least in this tip is to have an instruction sheet. So this gives them brief details of how they need to update the file. So here we have in the first column the sheet which they need to go to. The second column tells them what they need to do. And in the third column, we can see this status. So I've used conditional formatting and data validation. We'll see data validation in a minute, so that they can mark which items have been completed. So if I just say this has been done, then it turns to green. So you can immediately see on this sheet how far someone got in updating this file. Maybe they've got this far here, but didn't manage to update the assumptions. So anyone opening the file, looking at this sheet, can immediately see what the status is. Is it completed or is it not complete? Okay, so that's also very good. And having an instruction sheet means that nothing gets forgotten. The steps are all completed in the order which they should be completed. And this is very good. Even if you're the only person using the file, you developed it, sometimes it's very helpful to have this list of instructions so that you yourself don't forget, particularly if it's a file you're only updating once a month or once a year. So that's the third tip, to have best practice, to use best practice rules and have an instruction sheet. I find that's very useful. Okay. Now, the next tip is concerning the input cells. I said in the previous version, one of my criticisms was that we couldn't easily identify for the user which cells are the inputs. So now how have I solved that? Well, if I look on the actual input sheet here, where you can enter the actual sales by brand, and we only have actual figures for the actual periods, we can see these input cells are clearly marked, clearly formatted. They have a gray background with a white border. Okay. So we'll come on to that, how we can do that in a minute, but I just wanted to show you that's how it looks like. And if I go into the sales planning sheet, we can also see here on this sheet, which is very similar to the version I showed you before, but now we have the added advantage that the input cells are clearly marked in gray. So the user can see if or where they can input data assumptions. Okay. So how do we do that? So let me show you. I've got one I've prepared earlier. So if I unhide a sheet here, which I prepared earlier, which is basically the same as this sheet, but without some of these formattings and so on them. So now I'm going to show you how we can mark the input cells. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, first of all, we need to know which cells are the input cells. Okay, so there's two ways you can do that. If you go to formulas and show formulas, you can then see here, here we've got formulas, and here we've got some numbers. So those are the inputs apparently in these rows here. Okay, so that's one way you can do it. If your sheet isn't so big like this, then maybe that's a good way to do it. Another way to do it, particularly if you have a very large sheet, is with lots and lots of rows and lots of columns. You want to be able to automatically mark the input cells. So you can do that by marking all the cells where your input cells are somewhere in here. So select all of those, and then use the shortcut F5, which is go to. And if you go down to the bottom here, now I can't do this because the sheet is protected. So I need to work on this sheet and it's protected. How can I unprotect it so that I, as the developer, can change that? So on the cover sheet, I've got here an unprotect macro, which I'll show you at the end. And type in a password, which is not C for not consulting. Here I've chosen a different password to the password to open the file, because here I want to distinguish between two types of users. The end user of the model, they should only be able to open the file and change the inputs. And the second type of user is the developer, and they should be able to unprotect the sheet, unprotect the whole workbook so that they can develop, change formulas and so on. So unprotect, then it tells me the model protection was successfully removed. Now I can go back and show you here, and I can change things. So before it wasn't possible.
Gary, can I just ask a question about your formatting? Please. Is that a regional setting? So I noticed, is that a European thing where you have a comma where for the decimal place, right?
Yes, that's correct. Thank you for pointing that out. So yes, in Germany we have a dot for the for the thousand separator, and we have a comma where there's
the other way around, right?
The other way around. We have it the other way around. Yes. Okay, but thanks for that to avoid confusion. So what I want to do is here in this block here, I want to automatically select the input cells so that I can format them in a way which makes it very clear those are the input cells. So what I do is I press F5, and then I've got this option now when the spreadsheet is unprotected to click on the special button. And what I want to select is constants. So that's what Excel calls input cells. They are constants, and they could be numbers, text, logical, or errors. I'm only interested in the numbers, so I'll deselect those. I click OK. Then you'll then see that the cells which contain inputs are marked. Okay, so that's very useful. So now I can format those. Now, obviously, Excel can't select a cell which might have contained an input like here, but which currently doesn't contain an input, but that's fine. We can amend that afterwards. This certainly gives us a very good head start. So I've got all of the cells, the input cells marked, and now I want to format them. How do I format them? I just use the normal standard functionality. So I can go to Home, Number, here click in the bottom right-hand corner on the arrow, or use the shortcut Control-1 to bring up the Format Cells dialog box. And we see here we've got 6 tabs, and that's important to remember those for when we define a cell style later. So what I want to do is have fill a light gray. I want to have a white border. Now, when I click on white, all of these styles will change to white, which means I can't see them. So it's very important to select the style, the border style you want before you change the color to white. This is the one I want. So I can select white, say I want it outside and inside. And last but no means least, these cells are input cells. And what I want to do in the next tip is to protect, sorry, in the last tip, is to protect the spreadsheet so that only input cells can be changed. So that means if I have input cells, I have to remove this locked property, which means then when the spreadsheet is protected, users will still be able to change entries in these cells. So that's okay. I've done that. And now we can see that looks quite good. What I want to do, though, is to be able to apply this cell formatting very quickly and easily to other cells. So how can I do that? What I can do is I can define a cell style. So what I can do is up here on the Home tab, under Styles, I can click the down arrow, and I can define a new cell style. So what I'm going to do is going to call this KC for not consulting input. You can call it whatever you like. And here, these are the 6 points here. These correspond to the 6 tabs we saw in the Format Cells dialog box. So what Excel is asking you to do is to say which of these tabs, which of the formatting on which of these tabs do you want to be saved in this style name. Now, I don't want the number, the alignment, or the font. If it's an input cell, it could be different fonts, different alignments, different number formats. Those I don't want to save. I just want to have the border that it's white, fill is gray background, and protection, no protection. If you forgot to, for example, change the protection, you can just go into Format. You get the 6 tabs here. You can change it to click OK. And then when you're happy with that, you can click OK. And now you see up the top here, the cell style KC input. So what I can do is now mark all of these cells here. These are our input cells. So I'm going to mark those as KC input. I'm going to mark these here. What I can do is to do it again. I can either click on this or I can use the shortcut F4, which just repeats what I just did. And then I'm done on this sheet. So that is tip number 4, how to clearly mark input cells so that users know which cells they can change. Okay. So obviously, you can define this for each spreadsheet, or what you can do, what I do is I have a template file which I've defined my house styles, and I can just copy those across. You can copy them across by either if I have a new spreadsheet, I can copy one cell with this formatting. If I look up here, this style is not there. If I just paste it here, then this not only the cell gets copied, but also the formatting. So the cell style gets copied. Or I can go into here and say merge styles, and I can merge styles from the other workbook. Do you want to merge styles which have the same names? I definitely recommend you click yes, otherwise you're going to get duplicate names. And there I can see I've copied all the styles which I had in the other workbook. So that's something you can do with a template file. So now we've got that. Now we want to go on to tip number 5, which is to use data validation to restrict inputs to valid entries. So how can we do that? So what we want to do is here, for example, to say, I think that it's probably reasonable to expect that any changes to this percentage figure, to the sales growth figure, is going to be between plus and minus 25%. And I want to restrict people so that they can only enter values between plus and minus 25%. So how do I do that? Well, I'm going to mark these cells here where I want to apply the data validation. And then later I can copy that. I will show you how into the other rows. So I mark the cells here, and then I go into data validation. And as default, you can enter any value. That's the standard setting. But in this case, I want to restrict the settings. Now, if I click on the down arrow, I can see I've got various options here that I can use to select, to restrict the entries made in these cells. One of them is a whole number. That could be useful, for example, if I want the input to be a month number between 1 and 12, then I can enter the 1 and 12. That would be a useful entry here. In this case, I want to use a decimal. So the decimal is between, and if I try to type minus 25%, start again, minus 25% and plus 25%, and click OK, then it will tell me the minimum must be numeric value. So it's not allowing me to use percentages. So if I want to use percentages here, I have to type them as a decimal number. So minus 0.25, in my case, I have to use a comma. That's my regional settings, to plus 0.25, and then click OK. And now if I try to enter, for example, 30%, it will give me this warning. It's not showing properly. There, that's better. The value doesn't match the data validation restrictions defined for this cell. So it's not allowing me to enter a value outside this range, but it's not very helpful in terms of the user wouldn't know what is allowed from this. So what you can do here in the data validation rules, I mark them again, go back into data validation. And what I can do is I can type an error message here, which comes up when the user enters an incorrect entry. So you can have a title, which I usually just type the name of whatever it is that's being entered. So in this case, it's sales growth. So I just type sales growth. And then in the error message, please input please input a value between minus 25% and plus 25%. Okay. So click OK. And now if I try to enter a value that's outside, it will give me not just a standard message saying it's invalid, it will give me the message which I've typed in the customized entry. Okay. Now you could say, okay, a value outside of this range is probably unlikely, but maybe you want to allow that. So what you can do if you want to allow it, but just give a warning, you can change the data validation rules. And as standard, it's stop. But what you can do is give a warning instead. And when you do that, and I tried to type in 30, it just gives me a warning. I would probably need to change the message that normally we'd expect a value between plus and minus 25%, but do you want to continue with this entry? And if you say yes, then the value, although it's outside the range, it's allowed. It's just a warning. Okay, so you can decide for yourself which version you want, if you want the stop or just the warning. Once you've set up that data validation, you can copy this to other cells. So how can you do that? Mark the range here, Control C to copy it. And then here in the new line, we can go up to Home, Paste Special. And here we've got the option to copy and paste the validation. So just click OK. And then here, I can either go through the same again or use one of my favorite shortcut keys, F4, repeat what I just did. So F4. And now I can just test if this works down here. Yeah, okay, it's giving me, yeah, please input a value. Okay, so it's copied the validation rules over. If I enter -2, that's accepted. 50, no, not accepted. Okay, so therefore we can see that now works. Okay, so that's one kind of data validation. Another type of data validation, which can be very useful, is to use a drop down. So on the settings sheet here, what I want the user to be able to do is to select which is the last actual period. And depending on what's selected here, it automatically amends the period types here to be actual or plan. So what I want to do here is to use data validation. So let's go up to data, and we go again to data validation. And as standard, as always, the standard is it allows any value. So now I want to choose a list. Okay, now if we've got a list, if we've got a very simple list like yes and no, I can just type them in, separated by whatever your separator happens to be. Often it's a comma. In my case, my system settings, it's a semicolon, whatever it happens to be for you. You can do that. You can type the entries you want in the list here into this source. And if I do that, I can see I've got the option yes or no. Or you can have, for example, 1 and 0 for flags, turn things on and off. In this case, however, I want a longer list, and the list is already in my spreadsheet here in the top row there. So I can just select that. So I'm just going to go into here and select this titles here with the row with the year numbers in. Go back and click OK. And now the user can select any of these years. Okay. And to make it very clear, there's an input cell. I've defined another cell style called a drop down, which gives me this brown color. So which means that if I look on the cover sheet down here at the bottom, I've got this color scheme. It tells me a gray cell is an input cell and a brown cell is also an input cell, which with the restricted input is a drop down. So the user knows gray and brown cells, those are the ones he or she can change. And what happens if I change that, you'll see that if I change that, the years up to 2023 are marked as actual, and that feeds through to the other sheets and affects also the formulas. Okay. So that's that. That's tip number 5. So Daniela, we're getting some posts, getting some chat questions there.
We are. We've got quite a few comments and questions.
Okay. Very good. Let's go through some of those then.
Can I just, there were some questions about whether you would hard code or whether you would use the link for the data validation, just like you did there. There was a question about the input style. So most people tend to not use the input style. It seems like you similarly. Is it just because it's so ugly, or do you have another reason for not using the standard?
I saw the standard one up here, the orange one.
Yeah, that one.
If you use this one, you can use this one. So there are some standard styles defined. If I use this one,
it's just so ugly. I don't know.
I find it's ugly. Correct. I find it's ugly. And wait a minute. And the other issue, so it's the other issue I have with it. If I go into the formatting here, I can see that it's an input cell, but it's locked. So that means when you protect the sheets, which we're going to show you in the last tip, this cell will not be able to be changed. So you have to then go and change it and remove that. So what you can do is, if you want to change any of the styles up here, right click on them, click modify, and then go into the format. And here I can go into the protection tab, remove locked, click OK. And then I have to say that this, protection is not. So the protection here, this setting, this format in this is stored in the cell style called input, and the protection will then be removed. Okay. But as you say, I find it very ugly. So that's why I define
it. Do you have any tips for how to get around the fact that people can paste over a data validation? So frustrating.
No. Yes. Okay. So this is, yes. So the data, that's a very good question. There's a data validation here. Yeah. But if I've got something over here, say 2000 and 2000, okay. So I can copy this here into this cell here, and I will copy it as values so that it doesn't become obvious. If I just copy it straight away, then it just overwrites everything. But if I copy it as values, so paste special values, then it's accepted, even though it's an invalid entry. Okay. So what can you do there? What I would do is just to show you, I would just copy this down here so we can enter some. See, this won't allow me to do this exactly. So let me do this. I'll just show you what happens if you've got multiple. So we've got multiple entries here. Let's try 2015. Okay. So we've got multiple entries here, and I was just going to paste them in here as values. So now we've got some entries in these cells. Obviously, in this case, we only want one cell, one input cell, but I'm just showing you how it could work if you have multiple cells. So we've got lots of entries here. Some of them are valid, which are the ones between 2020 and 2026, but the other ones are invalid. How can we can't unfortunately prevent them being copied and pasted in, but what we can do is at least detect them. So what we can do is, so instead of manually going through and saying, is this valid, yes or no, what you can do is go and mark these cells and then go into data validation. And instead of just clicking on this button here, there's a drop down. And if you click on that, we've got the option to circle invalid data. If I do that, it then marks the invalid entries. And then I can go through and change those. So you can't prevent it, but you can at least detect it. So that's a useful tip. And then if you want to remove the invalid codes, you can do that and then carry on. So I hope that was useful. Something
Absolutely,
not a lot of people
great.
know. Yeah, okay.
Fantastic.
Right, so now I'm going to put this back and say this should be 2021. Okay, and get rid of that. Okay, so that's the tips 1 to 5. And now the very last tip is to, we've said we've protected, we've set up these cell styles so that the protection, the locked property is removed for the input cells and for any other cells as standard Excel to show you by looking in the formatting for these cells here. The standard setting for all cells, if you don't change it, is locked, which means, what does that mean? Well, it says here, it gives you a tip here, locking cells or hiding formulas, which I don't recommend, has no effect until you protect the worksheet. Okay, so how do you do that? It tells you here, protect sheet. So let's see how to do that. So if I go to review and click on protect sheet, now I can protect this sheet, and that would then mean that users can only change or can only do certain things. So the first thing to note up here is I can enter a password. If I don't enter a password, then it's still protected, but anyone can need to remove it because there's no password. So for the moment, I will just leave that blank. And then it gives you a list of what can the users do. So standard, they are allowed to select locked and unlocked cells, but they can't do any of these other things like format cells, insert rows and columns. In fact, insert hyperlinks are removed. The one I normally add in is use autofilter, particularly if you've got a data and data analysis rather than the planning model. It's very useful that they can use the autofilter to filter the lists of data. So I generally allow that. So when I click OK, this sheet is now protected. I can see that because up the top here, it's changed from protect sheet to unprotect sheet, which means it is protected. The option now is to unprotect it. And if I now try to overtype any formula, it will tell me I can't do that. It's on a protected sheet. Okay. But if I go into an input cell, I can type a number in here. That's no problem. I can type a number in here. Okay. So those are all possible. Yeah, just in the formulas, if I want to do a hard coding add here, no, it doesn't allow me. If I want to try and delete formulas, it won't let me because the first cell which is marked is a protected cell. Okay. If I wanted to delete these, I could delete those. Yeah, that would allow me to do it because those are input cells, which we've defined using the cell style that the locked property is removed. So I can change those, and that includes deleting them, deleting the content. But anything else I can't do. So that is very useful. So to protect the sheets so that the users can only change the input cells, you need to do two things. One, to set the property. And the second part is to protect the sheets. Now, when we do the protecting the sheets, if you want to unprotect them, I didn't set a password, just click unprotect. If you want to set a password, you can type in a password, for example, test. Okay. And then to remove the property and then I have to retype it to make sure I didn't a typo. Then when I unprotect it, I have to type in the password again. Okay. Now that's okay if you've got one sheet or two sheets, but if you want to do it for a whole model, that's a bit of a pain to go through and do that manually, to type in each time what's the password here, and to make sure you enter that password correctly in each case. So how can we get around this? Well, what we can do is you can use some macros so that when you open the spreadsheet, which is what I've got in here, it automatically goes through all the sheets and protects them. And if you need to make any changes, the developer needs to make any changes, they can unprotect it using an unprotect macro. Okay, so how can we do that? Well, what I've done here, I've got a file which I've set up for you. So I'm just going to go here and use this test file here. So this is a very simple file here, which just contains a few entries. So it's got planned sales as entries. Okay. So what we've got here, we want to protect this. So we've got the sales styles here. So these are unlocked, and we want to go through. This is only one sheet, but we want to have a macro which runs through when you open the model, protects all the sheets, and also offers the ability to remove the protection if necessary so that the developer can further develop the model. So how do we do that? So first of all, we need to look into the Visual Basic Editor. So what we need to do there is to go into Developer tab. Now, Developer tab as standard is not turned on. If you haven't got it turned on, then you just need to go to File, Options, and then here down on the Customize ribbon, on the right-hand side, you will see this Developer tab, and as standard, it's not turned on. So if it's not turned on, just click on the button there, click on the tick button, click OK, and you'll get the Developer tab. Okay. So someone said the macro is also here. Yeah, that's correct. The view, this is the view to the macros. To run macros, you can click on there, but to create them or amend them, you need to go to the Visual Basic Editor, which is here. And if I hover over that, you can see here, this is a general tip in Excel. If you hover over something, you get the tooltip, and if there is a shortcut for the keyboard, it shows that in brackets. So you can click on Alt F11. And this opens up a new window. You can see it's separate to the Excel window, but it's so the Excel is still in the background, and you get a list of all the worksheets which you have open, including some which are not visible, like personal workbook. So you need to find the workbook you're interested in. So here it's test. And if I right click on that and I want to import the file, and then just navigate to this file, we will send this to you, this part of the handouts, which will get sent to you after the webinar, protect.bas. And what it does there, it creates a new folder called modules and imports this, this macro. And in this macro, if you want to, you can open this file using WordPad, and it will, you can see here the instruction, gives you brief instructions here at the top, which I'm now going to explain. So what have we got here? We've got two macros, one to protect all the sheets, which basically says, go through each of the sheets and protect it using a password, which is here. So if you want to change it to your own password, you can change that. That's not a problem. And at the end, it gives you a message box to say we've changed it. Okay. And then if you are the developer and you need to amend the file, you need to amend the formulas, insert rows and columns, whatever, then you need to have the ability to unprotect the spreadsheet. So there's a second macro. This first of all asks you what the password is, and then it runs through, if you've typed it incorrectly, it runs through and unprotects all the sheets. And if it's incorrect, it tells you you've got an incorrect password. So that's the second macro. And then if we want the protect sheets macro to run automatically when we open the workbook, then we've got this separate bit of code here, which basically does exactly that. So what we need to do, we need to move this somewhere else. So we need to mark this code here, Control X to cut it, and we need to paste it over here in this tab called this workbook. So if you've got a longer list, like this one here, it's at the end. So you have a long list of all the sheets, and at the end, you've got this workbook. So it's always at the end of all the sheets. So double click on the relevant workbook and Control V to paste it in. It tells you that here, move the following code to this workbook. Okay. And what that does, it says here, when the workbook is opened, then this message box is displayed saying we're going to protect the workbook now. And then it calls this macro, which we just saw, protect all the sheets. Okay. So that's what that does. So let me just now save this file where I've now imported the macros, and it gives me this warning, which says, wait a minute, you're trying to save a file with a macro in a workbook, which is basically an XLSX format, and you can't do that. You have to select no, and then choose a macro enabled type. So I will do that. I have to then select a macro enabled type. There's two types you can use, XLSM, which is the standard one, or what I usually use is the XLSB, which is a binary version, Why do I choose that? It's very useful for large workbooks. It reduces the file size on the wherever you've stored it by usually at least a third. So in this case, the file is very small. But if you've got a workbook that's 10, 20 megabytes big, that can be a big space saving. So I save OK. And now when I go back to my folder here, I can see I've got two versions of this file. And I don't want to, as I said in the first tip, we want to make it clear to the user which version they should be using. So I'm going to move this test.xlsx to my old folder. So now I've got this folder. So now I'm going to close it. I'm going to close this one as well. So I'm now going to test it. So let's have a look, open the test, and it should run this macro automatically. What it will first of all do is say enable content. Macros have been disabled. So the first time you open it, you need to enable the content, and then it will run through and update the run through the macro and protect all the sheets. Okay, so that's the one-off activity you need to do to enable the macros. If I now close it, save it, and then open it again, it won't give me this warning because I've now enabled the macros. So when I open the file, it will automatically go through protect from changes, and it's now protected. So now just let me test that. If I try and overtype any of the formulas or the text, it won't allow me to do that, but I can, however, change any of the input cells. So that's how you can add macro protection to a workbook which you already have. You obviously have to previously mark the input cells and format them, as I showed you before, using cell styles so that the locked property is removed. And then you can add the macros in, as I've just showed you, so that you can get a file which is password protected. So that's how that works. Okay.
So that file, those files that you will make available to us include those macros, don't they?
Correct. Yes. So here, what you'll get in the pack afterwards is this good version of the model, which I just showed you. You also get this little text file which tells you the model has 3 passwords. One is to open it. That's for the user. And then for the developer, there's 2 password protections. One is to remove the sheet protection. And the other point here is to view the macros. That's something I didn't mention, which is very important. So in the file here with the macro protection, if the user is clever and says, okay, this is a macro, perhaps I can find out what the password is. Because if I want to remove the password, I want to remove the protection, I can perhaps look in the macros and find out what they are. So if I look in developer and go to macros here, Visual Basic, I can then, I can see this here and I can find out, there's the password. Okay, so what you want to do is to stop users doing that. We need to protect the macros so that not anybody can just open it. So to do that, it's quite easy. Right click on the modules, VBA project properties, and then you can go to protection tab, lock project for viewing, and then you can type in a password. And I suggest you don't have a third, but a second. I'm going to use the same password as to remove the protection. And OK, which means now that, because it's already open, I can view it. But if I then close it, save it, the next time somebody else opens it and they try to go into, so it's going to be protected. Very good. It's now protected. If I now try to go into developer and go into the Visual Basic to try and have a look at, what's this password? I can't see it. In order to open the macros, I need to have a password. Okay. So if I know that, then I can type it in and now I can see and amend the macros. Okay. The last thing to mention here is if I am the developer and I want to remove the protection, how can I do that? So there's 2 ways to do that. One is to, again, use the developer tab here and to go to this macros. And as someone else in the chat pointed out, it's also available under here under view. Thank you for that tip. So if I do that, I click on that and I get a list of all the macros available. Here I've got a lot because I've got like my personal workbook. If I select here, this workbook, it lists only the macros in this workbook. So there's only 2. I can select the macro unprotectable sheets, run. Then I can type in the password, which is in this case not C. And you can see here, because this is in a macro, the standard macro dialog box doesn't hide what you're typing in. So you just have to bear that in mind. So click OK, and then the protection will successfully remove. Now, as the developer, I can make changes here. I can insert rows, for example, to add new items, whatever I need to do. So that's one way of removing protection. Another way is to, if you want to make it really easy, in the model I showed you earlier, I had a macro button. You can just click on it. How do you do that? You can assign the macro to an object. What is an object? You can assign it even to a shape. Now I can insert a shape here, And if I right click on it, I can assign a macro now. So I can assign unprotect sheets, or if you want to use the standard macro button, then I can go to the developer tab here, insert, and the first option here, form controls, is a button. I click on that, then I can drag out my button, and then it asks me which macro do I want to assign it to. So unprotect all sheets. And then I should just type something in here, change the text, so text to text, unprotect sheets. Oops, sheets. Okay. And then when I click on this button here, it runs the macro. Okay, I have to type in the password, and then it's removed. Okay, so that's two ways you can do it. Assign, well, either use the macros and select the relevant macro, or you can assign to an object such as a shape or a macro button. Okay. So that's the 6 tips. So let me just quickly go through those so we can see, we can just refresh our memories what we've seen there. So the tips today are, first of all, ensure users know which file to use. That's version control. So making sure they're clearly named, you have a naming convention, and in the main folder, there's only one version of the file, move everything else to subfolders. Then we want to restrict access to authorized users only by saving the file in a folder which only, for example, people in the finance department have access to, or only an HR department, and or you can add a password. We didn't cover that point. Very good. So how do you add a password? So file, when you add a password, file save as. So it's a bit hidden, but it's very easy. So file save as, more options. You can go down here. And when you save it here, you want to go down to the bottom right, tools, and then here, general options. I don't know why it's called that. It should really, in my opinion, be called passwords, because that's all that's on offer here. It's a password. So you can type a password to open it or to modify it. So when you do that, if you type in a password, test, and then okay, and then you have to type in again, test, oops, see if you type it incorrectly, it shows you. Okay, so now I save that, and it will now tell me I'm going to overwrite the existing file. That's fine, and now I've got the password. So that's how you can set up a password. So that's tip number 2. Swap the users. So restrict access to authorized users only. Tip number 3, develop workbooks using best practice. So make sure that there's a cover sheet with a contact name so they know who to ask if they have any questions, and you've got an idea what it's for, because there's the aim of the model is in there. Then have a clear structure so that they've got a clear idea where the inputs, the calculation, the outputs, so that helps them understand the data flow. There's less likely to make errors if they understand the structure of the model. And key point here is to have an instruction sheet to list out all the actions that a user needs to make to update the model, and ideally with the status column, as we saw, so that it's very clear, anyone opening the file, what is the status of the update. Number 4, clearly mark input cells so users know what they can change. So as we saw, I use gray and brown cells, and the best way, most efficient way to apply that formatting to other cells is to use cell styles. Then to use data validation to restrict inputs to valid entries. We saw that here. We restricted the percentage inputs to a value between plus and minus 25%, and we restricted the year input to a drop-down list based upon a list of entries in the model. Okay. And last not least, protect the worksheet so that only the input cells can be changed, and that's most efficiently done with a macro, and I show you how to use the macro, which will be circulated after the webinar. You can import that into your own and integrate that into your own models. Okay, so that's the 6 tips. So I hope that was very useful to you. Are there any questions in the last 10 minutes that we can go through?
Yes, I think we have just enough time for 1 or 2 questions. There's a question from Henry saying that when you're copying some formulas from one workbook to another, sometimes it includes the reference back to the first workbook, like if you copy a sheet, for example, and sometimes people don't know what's happening and they get it wrong. Do you have any tips to avoid this?
Yeah, so yes, so let's explain what's going on. So if I have another sheet here called inputs, so it's now protected. So let me remove the protection. Test, I call this one. No, this one is my protection. So Alt F8. So if you have another Okay, so it's now removed. So if I have an entry on here, on this sheet here, on 123, for example, and on this sheet here, I have a reference to this other sheet here, then in this formula, I have sheet 1 F5 now. And if I copy this formula across to a new workbook, it is now linked to the sheet 1 in the other workbook. Okay. If I copy across a reference, which just is say to the cell above on the same sheet, then there's no problem with copying the formula across. Now it just refers to the cell 2 above, so that's not an issue. It's when you've got a formula which refers to another sheet in the model, and you copy that to a new workbook, then you get this text at the front. Now, this is something you have to be aware of. If you, for example, you've copied this formula from an older version of the tool, you made a mistake and you want to copy the version from the older model, then all you need to do, you've got in the new model, you will have this sheet called what do we call it here? Sheet 1. Okay. So outputs, let's call this one outputs. If you've got the same setup, and this is called sheet 1, now what you can do is, you can't prevent it, but at least you can remove it. So what you can do is this name of this this text test.xlsb, if I copy that, and then I can search and replace, test.xlsb with nothing, replace all, and then it's now linked to sheet 1, which could be, for example, inputs in this model. So that's one way you can get around that. Someone's mentioning also named ranges. Yeah, okay. So named ranges, if you want to refer, this is more formulas, not preventing user errors, but you can use range names. If I want to refer to this cell here, I can give it the name total sales, for example, by typing up here in the name box. So I select the cell or cells I want to name, and up here I can type a name. The names may not have any spaces, so either start each new word with a capital letter or put an underscore in between them. And then I can use that somewhere else. So I can just type equals, and I can either start typing the name, total sales, and then it comes up here. I can press tab to finish that off, or I can use the shortcut F3, which brings up a list of the names available, and I can use that. I can use that also in formulas, and that can make formulas very useful. But that's really writing formulas, not preventing user errors, but it can help prevent user errors if a user can see in the formula, okay, that's total sales. That helps them understand, and understanding a model will help prevent user errors if they can understand what's going on. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know that named ranges make it any better or worse in terms of user errors. I don't know what you think, Gary, but it's some people
I use them sparingly. You can overdo them, I think, and have a very long list.
And when you're copying sheets, they can someone's made
they can get copied. They get copied as well, and you can end up with a long list. So you can, if you want to, if you go into formulas and then here name manager, you can see everything is in your model, the list, and you can amend them or delete them. And some of them can be very hidden. If you've been working on a file that's been using an add-in, for example, they can create range names which are hidden, very hidden, and then you can't see them. So I've got a macro in my toolbar which unhides all the range names, and then you can go back in there and just check to see if there's anything here. Okay, in this case, I just created it as a simple spreadsheet, but in some cases you can find out a long list of names which you can delete. Okay. Yeah.
I don't know if you want to tackle the question about the circular reference, Gary. I can talk about that.
Okay, so that's that's something which circular references, again, you shouldn't really get those in terms of the user. That will be a formula error, unless, for example, someone types in here and types in this is equal to the total. Now, then you get a circular reference because it's saying, hang on a minute, I'm summing up here, and then what I'm summing up includes the total here, which obviously gives you a circular reference. It's something referring back to itself. And in this case, Excel is the circular reference happens on this sheet here. We can very clearly see it's very helpfully marked what the problem, where the problem is, and what you can do here under formulas, under formula editing, error checking, you can click on circular references and it tells you the list here. In fact, I use that a lot. So, well, when it occurs, I have it here on my quick access toolbar, so I can just go through the two cells. Sometimes the circle is a lot longer, and find where that problem is and say, okay, this one I need to change. So I separate circular errors into two different types of errors, circular errors. One is unintentional. So this one here, it was probably an error. I didn't mean to put it in here. I meant to refer to some other cell. I meant to refer to this cell down here. Okay, so then that's an unintentional circular error. The other type of error, circular error, which can occur is an intentional one. And the classic example is you have interest on a bank balance, and the bank balance, when you need to pay the interest, it reduces your bank balance. So then you need to pay less interest, and so on and so forth. So, it has an impact on your bank balance. So the interest affects the bank balance, which then affects the interest, and you get a circular reference. I'm a big fan there of using the previous value. So the using a value as the basis for the interest calculation, which doesn't include the interest. Okay. So some people might say, well, that's not accurate enough. I go into this in detail in my book. Yeah. My preference is to avoid having circular references by using, for example, the opening balance instead of the closing balance. Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly. So someone said that you need to kill a circular reference. Yeah, exactly. I would tend to agree to that. And if other people argue, the main argument against it is it's not accurate. But I've also tackled that in my book. I think when you're doing a planning model, it's anyway not accurate. It's your version of the future. It's a model. It's not going to be 100% accurate. So I think you can live with the inaccuracy, if you want to call it that, of having excluding the interest from your bank balance when you're calculating the interest. Yeah.
Someone has said we should change your name to Google, Gary.
Thank you very much. Okay. So I hope that was very useful for users today. And as I always say at the end of my training courses and webinars, use it or lose it. Yeah? So that means please implement these tips in your everyday working so that it becomes second nature. So what you can do is, as I say, use the handouts which will be sent afterwards. You'll get 4 things here: the model, the good model, which I showed you, so you can have a look at that and see, have another look how I did some of those things. Always remember, you need to remove the password protection if you want to have a clearer look at the formulas. And here in the little text file, you can see the passwords are named there. And then if you want to have the checklist, there's a checklist here. It's a 1-pager. You can print it out and keep it for reference. And there's also some extra links here. You can see videos on, for example, I've created a video on using data validation if you want to have a look at that. Or of course, you can review the video from today. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I can't believe how much you covered in such a short space. That was really, really useful. And I can see by the comments that everybody's found it incredibly helpful. So thank you so much, Gary.
Yeah, great. Right. Pleased to present that to you all. And I hope it's of use to you, and I can further my mission to reduce the numbers of errors in models.
Absolutely. Yes, it's something that we all should definitely take your lead from. Thank you so much for that.
Okay.
So we are on this side of the world. We are just going into our summer holidays because it's going to be Christmas soon and we have a very busy time of year. So we are going to take a short break for no more virtual meetups until January, depending on my travel commitments. I will stay tuned and I'll let you know when the next one is going to be. But until then, yes, the Gary's book. Yes, I'll pop a link to where people can grab his book if they would like to.
Yes, okay, but it's available on Excel on Amazon. You can just search for "Avoid Excel Horror Stories" or my name. You'll find it.
Yeah, fantastic.
Okay.